Welcome to the Feminist Park podcast. I'm Kwame.
And I'm Leilani. It's great to be kicking off this journey with you all today.
Yeah, we're diving into work that's really closely tied to the vision behind the Feminist Park project.
Imagining these truly equitable public spaces, starting with the idea for an intersectional feminist park right here in Berlin.
Exactly. And this podcast, well, it's kind of an extension of that. We're going to be digging into the academic research that, supports and informs that kind of vision.
We'll be taking these dense, sometimes quite academic papers and really pulling out the core and insights.
And looking at them through specific lenses, things like environmental justice, intersectionality, anti-colonial thought, queer theory.
All the stuff that helps us think critically about space. Imagine standing on the corner of just like a typical everyday city block.
Right. Any neighborhood, really.
Yeah, exactly. Any neighborhood. And really try to visualize the geometry of the space that's stretching out in front of you.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
You're standing on the sidewalk and you're looking out across the street to the buildings on the exact opposite side. And if you strip away the familiarity of that scene, like if you just look at the raw allocation of physical space, something genuinely startling reveals itself.
It really does. It's almost shocking when you actually map it out.
It is.
Yeah.
Because an overwhelming majority of the terrain between your building and the one across the street is, well, it's entirely paved over.
Just completely covered in asphalt.
Right. It's rigidly partitioned. It's heavily regulated by these intricate systems of lights and painted lines. And it is dedicated almost exclusively to the movement and storage of 2-ton metal boxes.
Yeah. Cars.
Yeah. Meanwhile, we as actual human beings are relegated to walking on these narrow, often crumbling strips of concrete along the extreme margins.
Yeah. Usually right up against the building.
Exactly. While the vast sweeping center of our shared public realm has just been completely surrendered to the automobile.
Which forces a pretty profound question, honestly.
I mean, how did we cede so much of our communal world to the car? And maybe more urgently, how does this invisible, everyday architecture fundamentally dictate our society? Like the health of our planet, and even the intimate details of our personal well-being.
It's arguably the single most defining feature of the modern built environment. I mean, without question.
Right.
And what makes it so powerful is just its ubiquity. It is so deeply ingrained in the background of our daily lives that we rarely even perceive it as a conscious choice.
Or just accept it.
Exactly. We don't see it as a choice that was made by urban planners and policymakers decades ago. It doesn't feel like a design at all. It just feels like a law of physics.
Right, like gravity or something.
Yeah, we treat the presence of a massive 4-lane road outside our front door with the exact same unquestioning acceptance as we do gravity.
It just feels like, the way things are. But when you actually start to look at the geometry of your own neighborhood, you realize that it absolutely does not have to be this way.
It really doesn't.
And so, welcome to today's deep dive. We have a very, very specific mission today. We are exploring the concept of the feminist park.
Which is such a fascinating framework.
It is. It's a framework for designing urban spaces that are geared toward genuine structural liberation. But here's the catch, right? And this is the reason we are starting where we are starting today.
You have to know what you're up against.
Exactly. To understand how to design truly liberating public spaces, you first have to thoroughly understand the systems that currently confine those spaces.
You have to map the exact dimensions of the cage, essentially.
Map the cage before you can even begin to dismantle it. I love that.
Which is precisely why we are taking what might initially seem like a rather unconventional starting point for a deep dive into park design and community space.
We really are. So, to help build out the conceptual blueprint for the feminist park, we are pulling our insights from this brilliant 2026 conceptual paper. It was published in the journal Transport Policy.
Yes, by Kostas Moratidis.
Right. And the paper is titled Automobility, Planet, and Humans: Pathways Linking Car Use to Environmental, Societal, and Individual Well-Being. So, okay, let's unpack this right away.
Let's do it.
Why on earth is a dense academic paper analyzing automobility and car use the perfect foundation for designing a feminist park?
Well, because Moratidis maps the exact anatomy of our spatial confinement.
Okay.
We cannot dismantle spatial inequalities, which, That is the entire underlying goal of a feminist part. We
Right.
can't do that until we understand the precise mechanisms of how car dependence actually sustains itself.
Because it's a self-sustaining system.
Exactly. The paper provides this incredibly comprehensive framework showing how the private vehicle dictates the entire terms of engagement for our public space.
Wow.
If the goal is to design a park that actually liberates its users, you have to recognize that you are stepping onto a battlefield where the car currently holds almost all the territory.
The territory is completely
Well,
occupied.
right. So understanding the car's monopolies, and crucially, why people defend that monopoly, is the mandatory first step to reclaiming that space for communities.
And Moratitas highlights a truly baffling paradox right out of the gate in this text. I mean, we are living in an era defined by an acute, globally recognized climate crisis.
Yes. Everyone is aware of the stakes now.
Right, we have sustainable transport policies being drafted in municipalities all over the world. The awareness of the ecological stakes has never been higher, honestly.
No, it hasn't.
And yet the data in the paper shows that global car ownership continues to rise. Like it is actively going up, not down.
It's a massive contradiction.
It is. Why are societies doubling down on the very infrastructure we know is environmentally catastrophic?
This raises such an essential question, and it really identifies the core failure in how we currently talk about urban planning.
What's the failure?
Moratitas acutely points out that most of the academic literature, the public debate, the political rhetoric, it overwhelmingly focuses on the negative impacts of cars.
Right, the emissions and stuff.
Exactly. We constantly hammer home the statistics about greenhouse gas emissions, the soul-crushing traffic congestion, the smog, all of it.
Which is fair.
It is completely rational given the severity of the climate emergency, but it represents a fatal strategic flaw for anyone trying to actually change human behavior or, redesign a city.
Because just pointing out the harm isn't enough to change the system.
Exactly.
It feels like the current discourse is just, well, wagging its finger at people, treating them like they were making these malicious choices every single time they turn the ignition.
That's exactly the trap. If urban planners and environmentalists only look at the harm cars cause, they completely blind themselves to why people are so deeply attached to their vehicles in the first place.
We ignore the utility.
We ignore the profound utility of the car. The central argument Moratitas makes is that if we want human societies to transition away from car dependence, we absolutely must acknowledge and understand the tangible benefits that sustain this dependence.
Right.
You cannot just demand that someone give up their car for the sake of global emissions if that private car is literally the only logistical way they can drop their kid off at daycare, pick up groceries, and make it to their shift on time.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I was actually sketching out some notes on this while reading the paper, and I want to bounce a kind of analogy off you to see if it captures what Moratitas is getting at.
Oh, please, go for it.
Okay, so imagine we've built an entire society out of steep, slippery staircases.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Everywhere you go, right? Work, school, the grocery store, you have to climb these treacherous stairs.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine we handed everyone a personal jetpack.
A jetpack, okay.
Decades go by, and suddenly we realize the jetpacks are disastrous.
Yeah.
They're incredibly loud, they burn toxic fuel, and the exhaust is just choking everyone stuck at the bottom of the stairs.
Right, an ecological nightmare.
Exactly. So the policymakers start yelling at the citizens,
Mm-hmm.
like, take off the jetpacks. They're destroying our air quality. They're dangerous.
But they're ignoring the stairs.
Yes, they are completely ignoring the fact that without the jetpack, the citizens literally cannot get up the stairs. The environment dictates the tool.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So I have to push back against the typical narrative here. Doesn't this framework fundamentally shift the blame? I mean, it implies that the individual driver isn't the villain in this story, but rather a captive to a systemic physical design.
That is a highly illustrative analogy, honestly. It perfectly captures the tension at the heart of the paper. However, I would add a little layer of friction to it.
Okay, what's the friction?
The driver isn't the villain, sure, but their reliance on the jetpack actively reinforces the necessity of the stairs.
Oh, wow. Right.
It is a complicity born of necessity. What Moratitas does to untangle this is introduce a new conceptual model that organizes the impacts of automobility into 3 distinct pathways:
Okay, what are the pathways?
environmental, societal, and individual. When you separate the impacts into these 3 lanes, the contradiction becomes starkly visible.
How so?
The system generates collective societal and environmental ruin, right? But it simultaneously offers indispensable, hyper-individualized lifelines.
Collective ruin versus individual lifelines. That is such a powerful phrase. And that is the exact tightrope you were walking as you conceptualize the feminist park.
Precisely.
You have to figure out how to provide the lifeline without subsidizing the ruin.
Which is an incredible design challenge.
It is. So to do that, we need to thoroughly investigate these three pathways. Let's dig into the environmental lens first. This is the pathway we are probably the most conversant in, but Moratias gets incredibly specific about the underlying mechanisms of this destruction.
It is critical to establish right away that in this model, the environmental pathways are strictly and unequivocally negative.
There's no upside.
None. There is no positive ecological outcome derived from mass automobility. The text details how passenger cars are the primary drivers of transport-related greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
But it goes far beyond the tailpipe. The environmental toll includes the massive global resource extraction required for manufacturing.
Like the raw materials.
Exactly. We are talking about the industrial mining for steel, the lithium and cobalt extraction for batteries, the rubber production for tires.
Which is huge right now with EVs.
Right, all of which require devastating ecological interventions before the car even drives its very first mile.
And the paper doesn't just focus on the global atmosphere either. It zeroes in on the localized impacts that actively degrade the everyday experience of living in a city. It changes the literal physical environment of the street.
Yes. The localized mechanisms are profound. Take noise pollution, for example.
Which we just tune out, mostly.
We do. We often think of noise as just an annoyance, maybe a nuisance. But the paper links it directly to severe public health crises.
Like what kind of crises?
Well, the constant decibel load of engines, and particularly the rolling resistance of tires on asphalt, that low hum.
Right, the tire noise.
It keeps the human nervous system in a constant, low-level state of fight or flight.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yes. This chronic stress elevates cortisol levels, and over time, that is directly linked to cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and significant mental health struggles.
Just from the background noise of the street.
Exactly. Then there is the urban heat island effect, which is another huge factor.
Right, let's look at the thermodynamics of that, because that directly impacts how a park functions or fails to function.
So think back to the geometry of the city block you mentioned earlier, that vast expanse of asphalt.
The blacktop.
It has an incredibly low albedo. That means it absorbs a massive amount of solar radiation throughout the day instead of reflecting it.
It just soaks up the sun.
Right. And cars themselves also generate and emit heat from their engines and exhaust. Then, as the sun goes down, that miles-long sheet of black pavement slowly radiates all that stored heat back into the environment.
So it never actually cools off.
Exactly. It prevents the city from cooling off at night, which drastically exacerbates thermal discomfort and actively drives up heat-related fatalities during the summer months.
That is terrifying. And structurally, the spatial demands of the car dictate urban sprawl, which the paper identifies as a massive driver of biodiversity loss, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when you build highways to connect sprawling suburbs, you aren't just paving over grass.
Yeah.
Right? You are physically fragmenting ecosystems.
You're cutting off nature.
You are cutting off wildlife corridors. You're isolating genetic pools of local fauna. And you're replacing the natural water cycle with these impervious surfaces that cause toxic runoffs.
It's a complete disruption of the local ecology.
It really is.
Yeah.
When you map out the mechanisms, it sounds completely apocalyptic, but there is a vital intersectional layer to this environmental devastation that Moratitas points out.
Yes, the inequity.
Exactly, which is crucial for a park design rooted in equity. Who is actually paying the price for the pavement?
That is the crucial question of global inequity. Moratitas highlights that the environmental costs of automobility are profoundly and structurally misaligned with the benefits.
How so?
Well, the wealthier, heavily car-dependent nations of the global north are the ones primarily driving the atmospheric carbon problem.
Right.
Yet, due to the mechanics of climate change, it is the lower-income regions of the global south that suffer the most catastrophic consequences.
The extreme droughts, the flooding.
Exactly. Extreme droughts, rising sea levels, severe weather events, and they face these consequences while possessing a fraction of the economic resources to adapt or rebuild.
So the populations who have contributed the least to the jetpack system, going back to the analogy.
Yes, the jetpack system.
They're the ones choking the hardest on the exhaust.
Perfectly said.
It is a massive systemic transfer of environmental harm from the privileged to the marginalized. And understanding who pays that price transitions us naturally into the second pathway the paper explores, which is the societal and socioeconomic perspective. we've established how the planet is altered. Now let's examine how the actual social fabric is altered.
At the societal level, Moratides makes it clear that the dominance of car-based mobility is not just an infrastructure issue. It is a pressing crisis of social justice.
A justice issue.
Yes. When a municipality or a state prioritizes car infrastructure, they are making a zero-sum financial decision.
Because budgets are finite.
Exactly. Expanding a highway or maintaining vast parking networks actively diverts critical public resources away from public transit systems.
Right.
And away from active transport infrastructure like protected bike lanes and safe pedestrian pathways.
This is a really important mechanism to grasp. Budgeting is a physical act.
It is.
When a city council votes for a highway expansion, they are mathematically voting to defund the bus line.
Exactly. It is an act of socioeconomic exclusion written straight into the city budget.
Wow.
Car-oriented development structurally reduces access to essential services for anyone who isn't a driver. It limits their fundamental mobility rights.
Which is huge.
The built environment ends up heavily privileging the demographic that can afford car usership, while chronically underfunding the low-carbon, accessible alternatives that lower-income residents rely upon.
Which brings us to a concept in the paper that I think is absolutely vital. It's this idea of forced car ownership.
Yes, a critical concept.
Because we culturally talk about cars as luxury items, right?
Yeah.
Or symbols of upward mobility, like you get a raise, you buy a nicer car.
The American dream, essentially.
Exactly. But for vast swaths of the population, especially those with lower or middle incomes, Moratides states that car ownership is a brutal practical necessity.
It is.
It is a massive economic burden that they're forced to take on simply to survive in a built environment that offers them no other choice.
It functions as a systemic economic trap. I mean, think about the mechanics of it.
Walk us through it.
Individuals who might never willingly choose the financial burden of a car are forced into the automotive market just to maintain their employment.
Because the bus takes 2 hours instead of 20 minutes.
Exactly. Or to get to a grocery store that isn't a food desert, or to access medical care. So they have to take on auto loans.
And usually not great loans.
Often subprime loans with predatory interest rates. Plus, you have the recurring costs of mandatory insurance, volatile fuel prices, and totally unpredictable maintenance.
Right, a flat tire, a broken engine.
For a low-income household, a single broken transmission can trigger a cascade of economic failure. It leads to job loss, which leads to eviction.
Because they can't get to work.
Right. Moratides points out that this imposes a severe financial strain that actively compromises their overall economic well-being.
It is essentially a privatized tax levied on citizens just for the privilege of participating in society.
A privatized tax is a great way to frame it.
But here is where we have to look really closely at the source material, because Moratides introduces a complex economic nuance that, honestly, we have to report impartially.
We do.
The societal pathways aren't entirely negative in a macroeconomic sense.
That's right. If we are analyzing the complete system objectively, we have to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth that automobility generates massive economic activity.
Like jobs and GDP.
Yes. It is a pillar of global employment across multiple sectors: manufacturing, energy, logistics, sales, and of course, infrastructure maintenance.
It's a massive industry.
And furthermore, Moratides points out that in certain political contexts, the automotive industry generates immense tax revenues for the state.
He specifically cites the Nordic countries here, right?
Yes, he does. In several Nordic nations, there are exceptionally high taxes imposed on car purchases, annual registration, and fuel.
Okay.
And those specific tax revenues flow directly into the central government budget. They are then used to help fund their expansive social welfare programs.
Like what kind of programs?
Things like universal health care, free higher education, and incredibly robust social safety nets.
Okay, I have to push back on this heavily because when you map out that economic loop, it sounds completely broken.
It's very convoluted, yes.
Wait, so the system traps lower-income people in forced car ownership because the spatial design requires it.
Right.
It then taxes them heavily for the use of that required car.
Yes.
And then the government uses that tax money to pay for the social welfare programs those exact people desperately need because the forced car ownership made them financially vulnerable in the first place.
It's a loop.
Isn't that an incredibly predatory cycle?
It is what urban planners actually call a wicked problem.
A wicked problem.
Yes, because it is deeply contradictory. You are absolutely right to point out the friction there. The system is structurally dependent on the revenue generated by the very behavior it theoretically wants to reduce.
Right. They want less emissions, but they need the money.
Dismantling the car system is economically terrifying for these states because their societal safety net is partially funded by the taxation of this ecologically and socially damaging transport mode.
That is wild.
It highlights how deeply entangled the car is with the foundational economics of the modern state. The system funds the societal safety net while simultaneously fraying the social fabric. It's a complete paradox.
It really is.
But this brings us to what I think is the most revelatory part of Muratidis's framework, and the part that speaks most directly to the mission of designing the feminist park.
Yes, the individual level.
Right. We have looked at the planetary ruin and the societal taxation. Now, we had to examine the third set of pathways, the individual pathways. This is where we finally answer the question of why people cling to their cars with such fierce loyalty.
This is where the framework demands that we practice empathy in our urban analysis.
Empathy.
Yes. Muratidis outlines the positive individual pathways for car users, and they are profound.
What are they?
Accessibility, comfort, privacy, and above all else, flexibility.
Flexibility.
Yeah.
I want to view this specific benefit through a feminist and gendered lens because the text uses some very specific language here that completely reframes the narrative for me.
It really changes the conversation.
It does. The paper explicitly notes that cars allow for what urban planners call trip chains,
Trip chains, yes.
as well as caretaking and the transport of goods. Let's really break down the mechanics of a trip chain versus a traditional commute, because I think a lot of people don't realize there's a difference.
Okay, so if you look at the historical, somewhat patriarchal design of public transit, it is heavily optimized for a linear radial commute.
From the suburbs to downtown.
Exactly. The assumption is a straight line. A worker leaves their suburban home in the morning, travels downtown to an office, and travels back on the exact same line in the evening.
Like a train line.
Subways and commuter rails excel at this kind of movement, but caretaking does not look like a straight line.
No, it doesn't.
Caretaking is a chaotic, decentralized web of movements.
Exactly. The journey of a caregiver is highly fragmented. Just walk through the reality of that daily logistics puzzle for a second.
It's exhausting just to think about.
Right. You might have to drop a toddler off at a daycare center.
Yeah.
Then you have to drive across town to check in on an elderly parent or drop off their medication. Then you swing by the pharmacy. Then commute to a part-time job. And then pick up 3 days' worth of groceries on the way back to pick the child up from daycare before it closes.
It is a trip chain.
That is a trip chain. And as Muratidis points out, the flexibility of the private car, the ability to execute that incredibly complex route without being beholden to rigid, infrequent, or delayed transit schedules, it is not a luxury.
Not at all.
It is a literal lifeline.
And because we know, statistically and sociologically, that the immense burden of caregiving disproportionately falls on women, the car transforms into a highly gendered tool for survival.
Wow, yeah.
When the public transit system requires you to carry 3 heavy bags of groceries and manage a crying toddler onto a crowded bus,
Which is a nightmare.
and then wait 45 minutes in the rain for a transfer to another bus line, the transit system has functionally failed you.
It has failed.
In that context, the private car acts as a private coping mechanism for navigating a public world that simply was not designed to support the realities of caretaking.
The car is a shield.
A shield, yes.
And Muratidis expands on this shield metaphor really powerfully. The paper notes that the car offers, quote, protection from unpleasant conditions and provides a, quote, sense of privacy and social safety.
Which is so important to highlight.
I think this highlights one of the most massive failures of our public spaces. Because for many women, non-binary individuals, and marginalized genders, public transit and public streets are simply not experienced as safe spaces.
That is a critical failure of the built environment. Public transit stops, poorly lit pedestrian underpasses, crowded train cars, these can be sites of intense vulnerability, harassment, and stress.
Absolutely.
The private car offers something public space currently does not offer: a walkable door.
Walkable door, that's it.
It provides a hermetically sealed, controlled environment that allows an individual to move safely through a public realm that is actively hostile to their presence.
So when well-meaning environmentalists or urban planners say, just ditch the car and take the bus,
Right.
they are completely ignoring the very real social safety deficit that marginalized individuals face every single time they step into public space.
They're missing the whole picture.
The car is their armor. They are buying private armor because the public square refuses to protect them.
Exactly.
And you see a structurally similar dynamic when you apply an ableism and disability justice lens to the findings in this paper, too.
Absolutely you do. Moratides makes a direct connection between the individual accessibility provided by the car and access to healthcare.
Okay, tell me more about that.
For individuals with limited physical mobility, chronic illnesses, or specific disabilities, navigating the physical barriers of public transit is not just an inconvenience.
Right, like broken elevators.
Broken elevators, steep stairs, long walking distances between stops. For many, that is an impossibility. In many contexts, possessing a private vehicle can literally be the determining factor in whether or not someone receives medical care. The text notes that this timely access to healthcare can have a substantial, quantifiable impact on overall health outcomes and literally on life expectancy.
So for a disabled person living in a car-centric city, taking away the car without first replacing it with a truly equivalent, universally accessible system, that is quite literally a threat to their life expectancy.
It is a matter of life and death in some cases.
When, of course, Moratides addresses the brutal flip side to this mobility dynamic as well.
Right. The paradox of the car is that while it temporarily empowers those who possess the physical ability and financial means to drive, the built environment it demands actively disables those who cannot.
Because everything is so spread out.
Exactly. Those who cannot operate a car, whether due to visual impairments, cognitive disabilities, physical limitations, or simply because they are elderly or too young to hold a license, they face severe systemic mobility disadvantages.
They are trapped.
The car-centric system deepens existing inequalities by essentially exiling anyone who doesn't fit the narrow profile of an able-bodied licensed driver who can afford a vehicle. If you cannot drive, you are locked out of the city.
It is a system of radical exclusion that masquerades as universal freedom.
That's exactly what it is.
And this brings us directly to your mission, right? This is where the theoretical pathways crash into the physical design of the feminist park.
Yes, the application.
How do we take all of this, the
Right.
environmental destruction, the brutal economics of forced ownership, the absolute necessity for social safety, the complex logistics of trip chains? How do we synthesize all of that into the architecture of a public park?
The translation from theory to design lies in understanding the spatial monopoly of the car.
The spatial monopoly.
Yes. Marnadis makes a foundational argument regarding the geometry of our cities. Automobility is profoundly space inefficient.
Just geometrically speaking.
Yes. A private car transports relatively few passengers, often just one person, while monopolizing vast swaths of prime urban real estate. I mean, think about parking.
Right.
A car sits idle, completely unused, for roughly 95% of its lifespan.
95%.
We have dedicated countless acres of our cities to the storage of empty metal boxes. The text explicitly states that this spatial monopoly consumes land that, quote, could otherwise support more sustainable transport modes or community infrastructure, like parks, social spaces, and amenities.
Community infrastructure.
There it is.
That right there is the mandate for the feminist park. The paper is pointing directly at the asphalt at the parking lot and saying this space belongs to the community.
It does.
But designing for liberation means recognizing that a feminist park isn't just about, planting a few trees and putting in a wooded bench.
Got it all.
It is a direct, confrontational intervention into what Moratides terms the institutionalized prioritization of the car.
Confrontational is the right word.
By physically taking space away from cars, by tearing up the asphalt and reallocating that geometry to pedestrians, to caretakers, to children, to the elderly, the park directly combats the systemic mobility injustices we have spent all this time mapping.
It is a profound act of spatial redistribution.
Yeah.
But, and this is the architectural challenge, really, redistributing the space is only the first step. You cannot just remove the infrastructure of the car and leave a void.
You can't just ban cars and call it a day.
No, you must actively address the why. You have to physically replace the benefits that the car currently provides to the individual.
This is the brilliance of applying the Moratides framework to design, honestly. If you just ban cars from a street, you leave the caretakers and the socially vulnerable completely exposed.
It took away their armor.
You took away their armor. The feminist park must strive to provide the physical safety, the comfort, and the social connection that people currently feel forced to buy a private car to achieve. If the car provides a sense of privacy and social safety, as the text notes, Your park must be engineered to provide that exact same safety, but communally rather than privately.
Yes, and think deeply about what that means for the physical mechanisms of the space.
Like, practically speaking.
Practically, it means designing lighting infrastructure that ensures absolute visibility and security at night, eliminating the shadowed vulnerabilities of traditional parks.
No dark corners?
Right. It means engineering architectural shelters that offer genuine protection from unpleasant conditions. Wind, rain, extreme heat.
To replace the climate control of the car.
Exactly, mimicking the climate-controlled comfort of a car interior but without the carbon footprint. It means ensuring that every single pathway is wide, smoothly paved, and seamlessly accessible for wheelchairs and double-wide strollers, thereby facilitating those complex trip chains without friction.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
It means creating thoughtfully segmented spaces where a caregiver can rest and recharge while their child plays safely in sight.
Sort of replacing that moment of peace you get in the driveway.
Yes. Replicating the restorative, isolated pause one might take while sitting in a parked car, but doing so within a vibrant, supportive, communal setting.
You are taking the private armor of the car and transmuting it into a public sanctuary. You are socializing the safety.
Socializing the safety. That's beautiful.
But we have to be realistic about the forces working against this kind of liberation, don't we?
We do.
They are deeply structurally entrenched. So before we conclude, we have to look at the final piece of Maratidis' model, which outlines the causal loops, the dune loop of car dependency.
The dune loop, yes. The paper presents a full conceptual loop demonstrating how these three pathways, environmental, societal, individual, how they feed into and amplify each other.
How does it start?
It creates a vicious self-reinforcing cycle. The mechanism works like this. The profound individual benefits of driving, the flexibility for caretaking, the immediate social safety we talked about, that triggers more people to purchase and use cars.
Okay, more cars on the road.
Right. This increased volume of car use forces society and local governments to prioritize car-oriented built environments.
They build more roads.
They dedicate more space to roads and parking while simultaneously defunding public transport.
Right.
That societal shift degrades the non-car environment, making it even harder, more dangerous, and more time-consuming to survive without a vehicle.
So you have to buy a car.
This pushes even more people into the financial trap of forced car ownership.
Which accelerates the environmental damage.
Exactly. It accelerates the environmental degradation, leads to more sedentary lifestyles, increases emissions, and consumes even more public space.
Which just makes the car even more necessary.
Which only further cements the absolute necessity of the car.
It is a brilliantly designed self-reinforcing cage.
It really is.
I mean, the more people who use the jetpack, the steeper and more dangerous the stairs get, until the stairs are completely impassable and the jetpack is absolutely mandatory for survival.
And everyone is choking on the fumes.
So how do we break a systemic loop that is wound that tightly?
Well, Maratidis concludes with a clear, uncompromising call to action.
Okay.
To halt the cascading environmental and societal damage, we cannot rely on shaming individuals. We can't just wag our fingers.
Right.
We must deeply understand these specific pathways and actively design cities, policies, and systems that structurally replace the benefits offered by automobility.
You have to replace a benefit.
You cannot just legislate the car away. You must render it obsolete by building environments that make it completely unnecessary.
You have to build the alternative. You have to build the park.
Yes.
Which brings us to a final sort of provocative thought for you to carry into your design process. For the last century, the automobile has been aggressively marketed to us as the ultimate unalloyed symbol of individual freedom.
The open road.
The open road, exactly. The wind in your hair, the ability to go anywhere at any time. But based on the rigorous mechanical breakdown in this text, we have seen that a car-dependent system actually forces us into severe economic strain.
It does.
It radically restricts the mobility of the vulnerable. It physically dictates how our cities are constructed and literally locks away the vast majority of our shared public space behind walls of moving traffic.
It forces a profound reevaluation of what freedom actually looks like in a spatial context.
Exactly. And, as we look toward the future of transport policy, there is this massive push toward autonomous vehicles.
Oh, self-driving cars.
Self-driving cars.
Yeah.
The tech industry promises this will solve all our problems, but apply the Maratidis framework to that future.
It's an interesting exercise.
If we just replace human drivers with computers, but we keep the geometry of the 2-ton lockable box, do we actually break the doom loop?
Not at all.
Or do we just get millions of zero-occupancy self-driving cars circling the city blocks forever to avoid paying for parking, taking up just as much space, and keeping us just as isolated from each other in our private armor?
The technology changes, sure, but the spatial monopoly and the social isolation remain completely intact.
The cage just gets a software update.
A software update, yeah.
So as you sit down to draft the blueprints for the feminist park, look at that geometry of the city block one more time.
Look at the asphalt.
Look at the paved expanses and the metal boxes. And ask yourself, is true freedom a private, lockable box that you are economically forced to pay for just to survive a hostile city? Or is true freedom a radically redesigned public space where your physical safety, your mobility, and your community connection are guaranteed by the very architecture itself?
A space where the environment itself cares for you, rather than forcing you to purchase your own protection.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the pathways of our built environment. Keep questioning the invisible architecture of your world, keep mapping the loops so you can dismantle them, and go build that park. This knowledge is a tool, really. A tool for seeing your city differently, and potentially for helping to change it.
It's been a really insightful deep dive, I think. This document provides such a vital framework, especially for projects like the Feminist Park Project that are trying to build something fundamentally different. It shows just how interlinked urban design and social justice are.
It really does. But it also shows the scale of the challenge, right? It requires sustained effort, real commitment, and a genuine willingness to shift power dynamics in how cities get made and managed.
Definitely. It makes you think about how we ensure those voices, the ones that have been excluded, are actually heard and centered.
There's another quote from Sarah Ahmed that feels relevant here.
Go on.
She says, "If you have to shout to be heard, you are heard as shouting."
That's powerful.
It makes you ponder, doesn't it? How can the design of public space itself work differently? How can it amplify the voices of those who've been historically silenced, ensuring their needs are met without them having to shout just to be noticed?
How can design itself listen? That's a really provocative thought to end on.
A lot to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.